Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Stormtroopers were the faceless enforcers of the Empire, but behind every mask was a man and occasionally a woman who had a life of their own. It's something we don't think about a lot. Stormtroopers are just the bad guys in New Republic holo dramas. They have one sole purpose, and that's to be gunned down by the heroic rebels. They hardly talk, they don't have families, they don't even go to the bathroom, or at least that's what the directors want us to see. By dehumanizing a person or a group of people, it's much harder to kill them off. Those white helmets and obsessively shined boots and armor were designed to specifically create fear and awe. Some were murderous and others were cowards, but most Imperial Stormtroopers were just average Imperials who were doing a job. Today we're going to try to humanize this organization and look at the factors that affected the morale throughout the Empire's reign. Palpatine had been the one who had orchestrated the Grand Army of the Republic and the Clone Troopers. With the Stormtrooper Corp, he wanted to recreate that same type of very efficient fighting individual, but at a lower cost. Genetically altered from one of the best mercenaries in the galaxy, Jango Fett, clones have been loyal almost to a fault, fearless in combat, and resistant to the stresses of death and destruction. With the creation of the Galactic Empire, the clone army's mission had changed. With the Confederacy of Independent Systems more or less defeated, the enemy switched from conventional armies to rebels and dissidents, oftentimes citizens of the Empire. The hardened infantry units who had fought on the grand battlefields of the Clone Wars were no longer needed. What the Empire wanted now was a peacekeeping army. The clones would have been perfect for the job, but they were genetically vulnerable and also extremely expensive to train. On top of that, the same accelerated aging that helped decrease their training time also decreased how long they could serve. It was far cheaper for the Empire to recruit amongst its civilian populace. Unlike the clones, they didn't have to be raised from birth on the government's dime. They had families that could do it for them. There was also a considerable drop in skill and ability, but the Imperial training doctrine was supposed to make up for that. While most citizens joined the Imperial Navy or Army, the most fit and capable made it to the Stormtrooper Corp. In the earlier years during the transition from the Grand Army to the Empire, the majority of the Stormtrooper Corps was still made up of clones. As more clones were injured or replaced because of their advanced age, more Imperial citizens began joining the rank and file. For a lot of clones, this was an unacceptable reality. These new Stormtroopers were seen as second-rate soldiers, which was to some degree true. They were just normal individuals. They had not been trained from birth like the Clone Troopers. Clones like Commander Cody would have gladly traded several Stormtroopers for just another single clone. Most of the remaining clones in the Stormtrooper Corps had fought in the Clone Wars and were combat veterans. Their entire lives had been about learning how to fight. It was almost impossible to replicate this kind of quality in citizen soldiers. But clones, being clones, would serve without any complaints as they did under the Galactic Republic. And for the most part, the new Imperial citizen Stormtroopers respected these older veterans and looked up to them for guidance and leadership. The clones that did survive mostly became NCOs, and at least during the first decade of the Empire, were crucial in keeping up unit morale and order. In Legends, the history of the clone troopers is a bit more complicated. For one, even before the war ended, Palpatine experimented with other cloning facilities, which actually made a lot more sense than the canon version of the story where the clone troopers only came from Kamino. Not only is it a strategic flaw to have all the clones manufactured in one place, Kamino didn't seem to have large enough of an operation to supply the entire army. Palpatine's new Spartai clones were a lot more obedient and less individualistic. They also only took 1 year to grow. However, these clones were far less effective in combat and performed more like battle droids, and also had the nasty habit of losing their minds and shooting friendlies. Another version of the cloning program was the Genode program, which created clones that were convinced that they were human beings, or normal non-clone human beings. The Kaminoans in Legends even ended up cloning their own special army of clones, which they used to rebel against the Empire, an uprising that was crushed by the 501st Clone Stormtrooper Legion led by Boba Fett at the time. This, of course, caused serious morale issues within the clone Stormtrooper ranks. The clones were obedient, but having to gun down their brothers in combat severely affected their view of the Empire and their own purpose. There was also the issue of Order 66. Many Stormtrooper clones felt uneasy with the idea of having biochips in their brains, and the ones that found out about these chips usually had them moved and left the Empire. The clone issue began fading away as less and less clones remained in the Stormtrooper Corp. Although even during the Galactic Civil War, clones still fought for the Imperial Army. As a matter of fact, Palpatine's own personal bodyguard was a clone. Prior to the destruction of Alderaan and the dissolution of the Imperial Senate, things were still quite good in the Empire. Stability meant everything for the citizens of the galaxy that still remember the horrors of the Clone Wars. The Clone Wars had exposed the weakness within the federal government at the time, and the lack of a national army had created a power vacuum and emboldened the Separatist Alliance to pretty much take over the Outer Rim. And so the call for a federal army grew as the Separatists took over more worlds. And soon this desire for military strength became so strong that it started sustaining itself. Something that Palpatine took full advantage of. As the Imperial military grew in strength, the government also needed more vendors and contractors to supply and feed this army. Soon entire planets full of resources, entire corporations and shipyards were all nationalized in order to help bring peace to the galaxy. So during this period of time after the Clone Wars had ended, the entire galaxy's industrial might had been harnessed by the Empire. And for a time, people were employed and factory owners and merchants grew wealthy. But gradually, the Imperial military became the only employer and source of income in many areas of the galaxy. This meant that joining the Imperial military and Stormtrooper Corps was oftentimes one of the most lucrative positions on a planet. During this time of peace, being a Stormtrooper Corps was a great honor. Whether it was serving on a remote base in the Outer Rim or being stationed on one of the massive Imperial Star Destroyers, this was a dream for almost every young man in the galaxy. The lure for adventure, patriotism, and service to the Empire is something that appealed to many people. For worlds like Vardos, the Empire represented an opportunity to rise in importance. Prior to the establishment of the Empire, Vardos was plagued by criminal elements and marauding pirates. The local economy lacked investments, and things were pretty terrible. The Republic, for all the good it did, was a bureaucratic mess. The Galactic Senate had become gridlocked by corporate interests and self-serving politicians. The inner worlds held a monopoly of power and saw the Outer Rim planets as a revenue generator, but at the same time weren't willing to provide them with any protection. And so, for Imperials like Rey Sloane, who had spent her entire childhood running away from criminal gangs, the Empire was just and good. As a matter of fact, during this period, for most worlds from the core to the Outer Rim, the Stormtroopers were seen as a representation of the greatness of the Empire, who brought with them prosperity and rule of law. Only a few planets had to be suppressed by the local Stormtrooper garrisons. These were usually planets that were very rich in resources vital for the war effort. Worlds like Lothal with high amounts of dunium, which was used in starship construction, or worlds like Jeddah, which had a large treasure trove of Jedi artifacts and kyber crystals. So while Stormtroopers were occasionally used to enforce the law on Imperial planets, more often than not they spent their time hunting down criminals and defending shipping lanes from pirates, which was exactly what most of these young Imperials signed up to do. The sense of purpose in their mission and the positive reinforcements from the civilian populace meant that Imperial Stormtrooper morale was extremely high during this period. It also didn't hurt that the Stormtrooper Corps was considered the most elite branch of the infantry. One did not get drafted accidentally into the Stormtrooper Corps. Almost every individual who served there wanted to be there. So while the Army troopers and Navy troopers had a bunch of slackers, criminals, and cowards in their ranks, the Stormtrooper Corps was mostly made up of very dedicated men and women who actually wanted to fight. The Stormtrooper Corps was considered an expeditionary force and designed to be deployed quickly to the other side of the galaxy. This meant they traveled light, and every Stormtrooper was an infantry soldier first, no matter what their specialization was. These individuals were also bombarded on a daily basis with Imperial propaganda to ensure more loyalty. Although the Stormtroopers were known for being cold and emotionless, they were very much an ideological organization, and many of its members believed in their mission and wanted to do good for the Empire. After the destruction of Alderaan and the Battle of Yavin, things began changing. Rumors of the destruction of Jeddah and the Imperial base on Scarif had already been circulating prior to these battles. Although both attacks had been covered up by the Empire and called rebel attacks or industrial accidents, the destruction of Alderaan and the revelation that the Empire had built a Death Star sat uneasy with many Imperials, especially considering the friendly fire incident on Scarif that killed dozens of rebels, but at the same time vaporized thousands of Imperials and Stormtroopers. These increasingly cruel actions by the Empire began alienating a lot of stormtroopers, which not only lowered morale, but also caused mass defection. At first, those who defected were usually in the Imperial Navy. These were oftentimes more open-minded and highly educated individuals who had the means to escape. It was much harder for an Imperial Army grunt who was stuck on a world like Mimbum, or a Stormtrooper without access to a spacecraft. The Stormtrooper Corp was also designed to be incredibly loyal to the Emperor itself, so they usually had very low rates of desertion. Well, at least in the beginning. There was also a lot of fanatics in the Stormtrooper Corps who created a group culture that severely punished even the slightest thought of betraying the Empire. The targeting doctrine was supposed to be a preventative measure that made the cost of rebellion so high that it was supposed to deter most people from joining. But it actually caused a lot more problems than it solved. Punishing and attacking rebel bases was one thing, but destroying entire planets and killing loyal Imperial citizens tested the loyalty of the Stormtrooper Corps. After the Death Star was destroyed by rebels, the Emperor continued tightening his grip over the galaxy and the Imperial military. The Imperial Security Bureau grew in size, and they closely monitored the Stormtrooper Corps, looking for potential traitors. Every Stormtrooper's helmet had a live video and audio feed that was sent to the local ISB controllers for analysis. Stormtroopers are actually punished for conversing with each other about non-mission related activity. Also, Stormtroopers were punished for taking off their helmets during patrol. It was also during this time that the Rebellion launched the Mid-Rim Offensive. This was one of the most massive ground offensives that the Rebel Alliance had launched since the beginning of the war. Most Imperials and some Rebels were shocked by just how large the Rebellion had grown. And for the first time, Stormtroopers were also tested on large battlefields. Despite having the advantage in numbers and war material, the Empire had to defend many worlds and were spread thin. The Rebellion was able to inspire a lot of local citizens to join their cause and took over many worlds. Stormtroopers like Thara Nendi of Solus had joined the Stormtrooper Corps because of the excellent pay. She was a good woman and a good Imperial, and during her off time, she would even deliver supplies and donate them to the local cantina run by her uncle. Many of the patrons there were actually part of a labor union that commonly caused trouble for the local government. Thara never reported these individuals to the ISB. She was conflicted about her duty to the local populace and also to the Empire. When Solus was attacked by the Rebellion, she was wounded and ended up leaving the Stormtrooper Corps after recovering. This highlights the internal struggle that many Stormtroopers faced. As the Empire became more desperate, it started cracking down more on its own civilian populace, especially more productive manufacturing worlds that were vital to the Imperial military. By the time of the death of the Emperor and the Battle of Endor, Operation Cinder had begun. This was a part of the Emperor's contingency plan and involved the destruction of loyal Imperial worlds so that the Rebellion couldn't get their hands on them. Any reasonable individual would have probably left the Stormtrooper Corps by this time. All that were left now were the most fanatic Imperials. So that is our analysis of what it was like being in the Stormtrooper Corps. As you can see, in the beginning of the war, when the Empire was strong and just and prosperous, most people actually looked up to the Stormtrooper Corps and morale was good. But as the Empire began falling apart and the Emperor kind of lost his mind and started killing Imperial citizens, things started rapidly changing for the Stormtrooper Corps as well. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.